On the afternoon of June 11, 1955, somewhere between 84 and 87 people were about to die in the space of 10 seconds. They were spectators at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the world's most famous endurance racing event. What they witnessed and what would happen to them would reshape motor racing forever, force governments to rethink public safety at sporting events, and eventually lead entire nations to ban motorsport from their borders for decades to come. This is the story of the 1955 Le Mans disaster. To understand what happened that afternoon in France, you need to understand the world of racing in the spring of 1955. It was a time of great technological possibility, a time when cars were pushing the boundaries of what was thought to be possible on a racetrack. The Mercedes-Benz team had returned to international motor racing after World War II and had absolutely dominated the 1954 and 1955 racing seasons. Their Formula One cars, the sleek silver W196 machines, had captured 9 of 12 races entered. They were the most advanced racing machines in the world, piloted by perhaps the greatest drivers who ever lived. Juan Manuel Fangio, the Argentine 5-time world champion. Stirling Moss, the brilliant British driver who many claim was never allowed to win a world championship due to poor machinery and political favoritism. These were titans of the sport, and they were in Mercedes machines. But Mercedes had not yet conquered Le Mans, not since 1952. And in 1955, they had created what many experts to this day claim was the greatest racing car ever built. The Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR, a machine so beautiful, so purposeful, so efficient, that even decades later, racing historians would shake their heads in amazement at what the engineers in Stuttgart had conceived. The 300 SLR was a 2-seater sports racing car built from an ultra-lightweight magnesium alloy called Electron. It was staggeringly fast, staggeringly powerful, and would prove to be tragically fragile in ways that nobody could have predicted. The British team at Jaguar was also contending at Le Mans that year. They had brought the D-Type, a car that was nearly the equal of the Mercedes in every way, and in certain respects, superior. The D-Type boasted advanced disc brakes, the best braking system in the field, and a driver lineup that included Mike Hawthorn, a Formula One driver from Ferrari who was determined to prove himself at Le Mans. Hawthorn was a charming man, a daring driver, and a man who would come to be associated with one of the darkest days in all of motorsport. There were other teams there too. Ferrari had brought their quick machines, piloted by drivers like Umberto Maglioli. Aston Martin was represented. Cooper, Porsche, and others were scattered throughout the field. But everyone knew that the race would be decided between Mercedes and Jaguar, between German engineering and British sporting tradition, between Fangio and Hawthorn. And then there was Pierre Levegh. Levegh was born Pierre-Eugène Alfred Bouillon in Paris in 1905. He had taken the racing name Levegh in honor of his uncle, a pioneering driver who had died in 1904. Levegh was 49 years old in 1955. He was old for a racing driver, especially in an era when modern racing cars were becoming faster and faster every year. He had a calm demeanor and a solemn appearance that had earned him the nickname the Bishop among his peers. But he was also a man of tremendous determination and pride, a patriotic Frenchman who desperately wanted to win the greatest race in the world. He had been close to doing it in 1952, leading for nearly the entire race, driving solo through the night, only to have his car fail with just an hour to go. It was a devastating blow. He had come back year after year to try again, and in 1955, Mercedes-Benz team manager Alfred Neubauer decided to pair him with American driver John Fitch. It was a shrewd decision from a political standpoint. Remember, World War II had ended only 10 years before. Having a French national driver competing for the German team would send a positive message about reconciliation and the future of Europe. Levegh was honored to be selected. He was thrilled to be driving for Mercedes. This was his best chance ever to win Le Mans. Around 4 p.m. on June 11th, the starting grid was lined up on the pit straight. The crowd that day was enormous. Somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 spectators had come to watch the race. They crowded the grandstands. They stood on ladders and scaffolding to get a better view, They clustered around the pit area, many of them separated from the track by only low earthen berms and wooden barriers. The track itself had not been substantially modified since the 1920s. Cars in that era had topped out around 100 miles per hour. Now, in 1955, they were approaching and exceeding 180 miles per hour on straightaways. The pit straight at Le Mans was narrow, tightly constrained, with spectators positioned dangerously close to the racing surface. The combination would prove to be catastrophic. The race began at 4 p.m., and it was immediately apparent that this would be an extraordinary battle. Fangio and Hawthorne pushed each other relentlessly for the lead. Fangio's co-driver Sterling Moss was also in the Mercedes lead car, and the pairing was nearly unbeatable. But Hawthorne was driving with a kind of desperate determination. He did not want to be beaten by a German car. Lap after lap, they traded the lead. The crowd was on the edge of their seats. This was racing at its finest. This was competition between the greatest drivers in the world in the greatest cars. The pace was blistering. And then it came time for the first pit stops. Somewhere around lap 35, roughly 2 hours into the race, the lead cars would need to refuel and service. Hawthorne was leading at this moment, pushing as hard as he could. He knew that his Jaguar's disc brakes could stop the car from a speed that would take the Austin-Healey of Lance Macklin much longer to accomplish. The Austin-Healey was a production-based sports car, relatively slow compared to the factory racing machines, and Macklin was being lapped. Hawthorne rapidly caught up to him. He passed him on the left, overtaking the British sports car. Then, as his pit crew had signaled him to do, Hawthorne signaled his intention to pit. He raised his hand. He pulled to the right side of the track, directly in front of Macklin's slower car. And then, trusting his superior brakes, he braked hard to slow down for his pit stop. Macklin, who had seen Hawthorne coming, had moved to the right to give him room. But now he found himself in a dangerous situation. Hawthorne had suddenly appeared in front of him and was braking hard. There was no way Macklin could stop as quickly. His Austin-Healey had conventional drum brakes, nothing compared to the advanced disc brakes on the Jaguar. Macklin locked up his brakes. He was about to rear-end Hawthorne. In desperation, he swerved to the left to avoid the slowing Jaguar. It was a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. Because right at that moment, coming up behind both of them at enormous speed, was Pierre Levegh in his Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR. Levegh was traveling at approximately 150 miles per hour. He was approaching this area of the track, where the two cars had just had their moment of crisis. Macklin, thinking he was going to hit Hawthorne, had swerved left. Levegh raised his hand in warning to the cars behind him, trying to signal them to slow down. But there was nowhere for Levegh to go. His Mercedes was traveling far too quickly. The front right wheel of his car rode up the rear left corner of Macklin's Austin-Healey like a ramp. The Mercedes was launched into the air. And in that instant, the entire course of motorsport history was altered forever. The Mercedes-Benz, traveling at 200 kilometers per hour, flew into the air over a protective earthen embankment. It traveled approximately 80 meters through the air, end over end, toward the packed grandstands. One eyewitness said it was like watching a bomb explode. The car landed on a concrete stairwell structure and disintegrated. Pierre Levegh was thrown from the cockpit. He landed on the pavement and was killed instantly, his skull crushed by the impact. But the destruction did not stop there. The heaviest components of the Mercedes-Benz, the engine block, the radiator, the front suspension, continued to hurtling forward into the crowd like shrapnel from an explosion. The bonnet, or hood, of the car became a guillotine, spinning through the air and decapitating spectators who were standing shoulder to shoulder in the packed enclosure. The debris traveled almost 100 meters into the spectator area. People who had climbed onto ladders to get a better view were suddenly exposed to lethal projectiles traveling at incomprehensible speeds. People crowding the underpass to the pits, using it as a shortcut, found themselves directly in the path of death. One observer recalled that the area where 50 people had been standing seconds before had become a clear patch with lots of bits. The rear-mounted fuel tank of the Mercedes exploded into flames. But this was not an ordinary fire. The body of the 300 SLR was made of magnesium alloy, a material chosen specifically because it was incredibly lightweight. The problem was that magnesium burns at an extraordinarily high temperature and with intense, white-hot flames. Rescue workers, unfamiliar with magnesium fires, poured water onto the inferno to try to extinguish it. This only made the fire worse. Water reacted with the burning magnesium and caused the flames to flare up even more intensely. The wreckage continued to burn for hours, showering the track and surrounding areas with magnesium embers that added to the carnage and confusion. Meanwhile, Macklin's Austin-Healey, heavily damaged by the impact, had spun backwards through the pit area. It had narrowly missed hitting other cars that were refueling at the time. But it did strike the pit wall and struck a policeman, a photographer, and 2 race officials, all of whom were seriously injured. Macklin himself, miraculously, stepped out of his wrecked car unhurt. Juan Manuel Fangio, who had been right behind Levegh, had driven through the burning debris with such precision that only a streak of green paint on the side of his Mercedes indicated how close he had come to disaster. Years later, Fangio said that Levegh's warning gesture, raising his hand in the final moment, had saved his life. It gave Fangio just enough warning to thread his way through the chaos. In the immediate aftermath of the crash, no one could comprehend the scale of the disaster. The track announcer, the famous Tom Cargy, came over the public address system and announced that a driver had been fatally injured. He did not reveal who. Within minutes, word spread that it was Pierre Levegh, the driver who had come to Mercedes to pursue his dream, the Frenchman who had wanted so badly to win Le Mans. He was dead, and with him had gone at least 82 spectators. The exact death toll remains uncertain to this day, with various sources citing numbers between 82 and 87. What is certain is that it was the deadliest accident in the history of motorsport. More people had been killed in this single moment than in any other racing accident, before or since. The question that immediately arose was whether the race should continue. Race director Charles Ferrou made the decision to keep the race going. His reasoning was that stopping the race and having 250,000 spectators attempt to leave the circuit simultaneously would create even greater chaos and would prevent emergency vehicles from accessing the accident site. So the race continued, even as doctors and volunteers attended to the dead and dying. The accordion music that had been playing over the public address system continued to play. Spectators fled in panic. Gendarmes and volunteers moved through the stands using advertising boards as stretchers. Priests administered last rites, and somewhere out on the circuit, the remaining cars continued to race. The Mercedes team manager, Alfred Neubauer, had been watching the race from the pit wall. Neubauer was devastated by the tragedy. His co-driver John Fitch had been standing with Levegh's wife Denise when the crash occurred. They both saw the entire catastrophe unfold before their eyes. Levegh's body, severely burned, lay in full view on the pavement. Fitch approached Neubauer and urged him to withdraw the Mercedes team from the race. It was, he argued, a matter of respect for the victims and a matter of public relations. Continuing to race after such a disaster would appear callous and insensitive to the German mark. Neubauer agreed. He immediately tried to contact Mercedes-Benz headquarters in Stuttgart by telephone. But the lines were jammed with emergency communications. It took hours to get through. Meanwhile, the 2 other Mercedes-Benz cars, driven by Fangio and Moss and by Carl Kling and André Simon, continued to race. In fact, they were running first and third in the race, in excellent position to win. But after an emergency meeting of the Daimler-Benz board of directors was convened in Stuttgart at the request of John Fitch, the decision was made to withdraw both cars from the race. It was a dignified gesture, a withdrawal made out of respect for the dead. At around 1:45 in the morning, the 2 Mercedes cars were brought into the pits and retired from the race. This left the field to the Jaguar team. Mike Hawthorne, who had been devastated by his role in the accident, had gone to his car looking completely distraught. He told his team manager Lofty England that he was at fault for the crash, that he had caused the death of dozens of people, and that he was never going to race again. England ordered him to do another lap before handing the car over to his co-driver Ivor Bueb. The two drivers continued to race and eventually won the race, but it was a hollow victory. The next morning, a photograph was published in the French press of Hawthorne smiling on the podium, sipping from a bottle of champagne, celebrating his victory. The French press ran the photo with the sarcastic headline, "À votre santé, Monsieur Hawthorne." To your health, Mr. Hawthorne. The image would haunt Hawthorne for the rest of his life. The question of blame became the subject of immediate debate and would continue for decades. Hawthorne, in the immediate aftermath, had apparently admitted to Macklin that the accident was his fault. He supposedly even apologized. But later, when he began to recover from the shock, his story changed. In his 1958 autobiography, Hawthorne claimed that he had signaled his intention to pit, that he had moved to the right at the last possible moment to enter his pit stop, and that he bore no responsibility for the accident. Macklin, who had read this version of events, was infuriated. He sued Hawthorne for slander. But before the case could be resolved, Hawthorne was killed in a car accident on a road near his home in Surrey in 1959. Lance Macklin himself would retire from racing after the 1955 season, his enthusiasm for the sport shattered by what he had witnessed. The official inquiry into the accident concluded that no single driver was to blame. Instead, the inquiry found that the accident was the result of a tragic combination of circumstances, including serious deficiencies in the track design and safety measures. The track was simply not designed for cars traveling at the speeds that modern racing machines had achieved. The immediate international response to the disaster was swift and dramatic. The French government imposed a complete ban on all motorsport activities, pending the creation of new safety regulations. The ban was lifted on September 14, 1955, when the Ministry of the Interior released new regulations for racing events and codified the approval process that future racing events would need to follow. But not all countries moved so quickly to lift their bans. Switzerland, traumatized by the disaster and by the image of German cars killing spectators in a French city just 10 years after World War II, banned all circuit racing in the country. That ban would persist for 67 years. It was not lifted until 2022, more than 2/3 of a century later. Spain banned motorsport. West Germany banned motorsport. Mexico banned motorsport. Mexico would eventually lift their ban, but the scars remained. In the United States, the American Automobile Association, which had been the primary sanctioning body for motorsport, including the Indianapolis 500 since 1904, made the decision to dissolve their contest board. They decided that auto racing was inconsistent with their primary goals and mission. The newly formed United States Automobile Club, or USAC, took over the responsibility of sanctioning and officiating American motorsport events. Mercedes-Benz made the decision to withdraw from all factory-sponsored motorsport. That withdrawal would last until the late 1980s. For more than 3 decades, Mercedes-Benz did not compete as a factory team in any form of motorsport, anywhere in the world. The decision was made not out of shame, but out of recognition that the company needed to prioritize the development of production vehicles and to distance themselves from an image that had become associated with tragedy. The 1955 season would be the last racing season for the Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR, one of the greatest race cars ever built. Only 9 of these cars had been constructed. After the Le Mans disaster, only a handful of races were contested before Mercedes withdrew. They won the Targa Florio and the RAC Tourist Trophy later in the season, securing the manufacturer's championship. But these victories were overshadowed by what had happened at Le Mans. The world was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of motorsport. Was it ethical to continue racing? Was it barbaric? Was the sport simply too dangerous? Should there be regulations to limit engine sizes? Should stock car engines be mandated? Was the track itself fundamentally flawed? These questions were debated in newspapers, magazines, and in personal conversations among racing drivers and enthusiasts. But the practical answer, in the short term, was that the sport would continue. The show must go on, as they say. Many of the drivers involved in 1955 continued their racing careers. Jimmy Bryan, who had been at the race, would go on to win the Indianapolis 500. Other drivers adapted and moved forward. The immediate crisis passed. But the long-term impact of the 1955 Le Mans disaster on motorsport safety cannot be overstated. In the years immediately following the crash, the circuit at Le Mans was modified substantially. The grandstands and pits were demolished and rebuilt. The track at and approaching the pits was straightened and widened. The Dunlop curve was realigned. A large ditch was constructed between the spectators and the track to contain debris in case of future accidents. The separation between the road and the spectators was dramatically increased. These were just the first steps in what would become a decades-long evolution of racing safety. In the 1960s, Formula One driver Jackie Stewart launched a concerted campaign to improve safety standards in motorsport. Stewart, who had himself been seriously injured in a crash, became an advocate for safer equipment, better protective gear for drivers, and more thoughtful circuit design. His campaign came in the aftermath of several high-profile driver deaths, including the deaths of Lorenzo Bandini and Jim Clark. But the groundwork for that safety revolution had been laid at Le Mans in 1955, when the world was forced to confront the fact that motorsport had reached a point where the risks, both to drivers and spectators, had become untenable without serious intervention. The tragedy at Le Mans in 1955 was a watershed moment in the history of motorsport. It was the moment when the sport was forced to grow up, to take responsibility for the safety of those participating and those observing. Before 1955, motor racing was largely a Wild West, where engineers pushed the boundaries of what was possible without much regard for safety. After 1955, safety became a primary concern. The sport did not stop taking risks. Drivers did not stop risking their lives, but the risks were now managed with much greater intention and care. Modern racing is incomparably safer than it was in the 1950s. Drivers wear advanced protective gear. Circuits are designed with runoff areas and barriers that are engineered to dissipate energy in a crash. Medical facilities at racing events rival those of major hospitals. The cars themselves are built with survival in mind, with strong cockpit structures designed to protect the occupants. None of this would have happened, or would have happened much more slowly, if not for the tragedy at Le Mans on June 11, 1955. It remains the deadliest accident in motor racing history. The exact death toll may never be known with absolute certainty. Different sources cite different numbers, but all agree that it was catastrophic, that it was unprecedented, and that it changed everything. Pierre Levegh, the 49-year-old Frenchman who had dreamed of winning Le Mans, became the symbol of that catastrophe. His body was covered with a banner and left on the pavement until authorities could recover it. His wife, Denise, watched the whole thing unfold. His co-driver, John Fitch, stood beside her and witnessed his friend and teammate's death. Levegh never won Le Mans, but his death ensured that everyone who came after him would race in a safer environment, protected by regulations and safety measures that would not exist if not for the tragedy of 1955. In the decades that have followed, the lives of countless racing drivers and spectators have been saved by the safety improvements catalyzed by the 1955 Le Mans disaster. That legacy, born in tragedy and blood, is the one thing that the racing world has always been able to build upon. Today, when fans watch the 24 hours of Le Mans, when drivers compete on circuits around the world, they do so knowing that someone, 70 years ago, paid the ultimate price so that they could do it more safely. The 1955 Le Mans disaster was the moment when motorsport learned that speed and glory could not come at any cost. It learned that there were limits, that there were lines that should not be crossed, and that the sport had a responsibility to protect the lives of everyone involved. That lesson has echoed through the decades since, shaping the sport into what it is today. A sport still dangerous, yes, still demanding, still thrilling, but fundamentally changed by the tragedy that unfolded on a June afternoon in France, when in the space of 10 seconds, 84 people lost their lives and motorsport lost its innocence.